It's a celebration of the restoration, the saving of Henry David Thoreau's birthplace, which is out on Virginia Road, interestingly enough, right near our offices, McGuire Associates. And interestingly, Henry was born in that house, and he is the only of all the historic Concordians who was actually born in Concord. So this is a great thing to preserve, and it's a pleasure for me to thank all the folks who over the years, through their hard work and through their wealth and through their wisdom, actually contributed to saving Thoreau Farm. I want to particularly, without short shrifting anybody else, give a special thanks to Joe Wheeler and also to Lucille Stott, whose book is going to be celebrated tomorrow at Thoreau Farm right out on Virginia Road. I want to point out that Thoreau Farm is not a museum. It's a working facility that provides space for the Thoreau Society, the famous International Thoreau Society, Robbins House, Gaining Ground, and also our Thoreau Farm Trust. I'm going to read a quick Thoreau Farm Trust mission statement. We believe Thoreau's extraordinary insights into life, nature, and social responsibility are as relevant today as they were during his lifetime. We hope you will find his birthplace, and please, everybody here, make sure if you can, you make it tomorrow as well, or some other visit to Thoreau's birthplace. A source of inspiration for living deliberately, practicing simplicity, and exploring new ideas for positive change. And Thoreau's work on life without principle is as important today, maybe more important today than even back in his time. But there's lots going on in our society, and we've got to learn more from Thoreau, Life Without Principle. I was going to read a couple of quotes. Maybe if I can do it quickly, I won't interfere with the panel discussion. But from Life Without Principle, my two favorite quotes from Life Without Principle are from Thoreau. This world is a place of business. What an infinite bustle. I'm awakened almost every night by the panting of the locomotive. It interrupts my dreams. There is no Sabbath. It would be glorious to see mankind at leisure for once. It's nothing but work, work, work. I think there is nothing, not even crime, more opposed to poetry, to philosophy, aye, to life itself, than this incessant business. He was railing out against something that, interestingly enough, he had to come to terms with as Concord's official surveyor and somebody who earned a living working while he was critiquing, taking me back to Wordsworth, the poem he wrote about the world is too much with us, getting and spending, we lay waste our I forgot the word.
Powers.
Who said it? Well, our powers, right. I keep thinking it's ours, but it's powers. And now I'm going to have the pleasure of briefly introducing our panelists, and they will introduce themselves through the great works they have done. First of all, our moderator is the famous Jack Beatty, who cringes when I introduce him as a guy I've known for so many years. He and I used to coach baseball together here in Concord and Carlisle, and we actually won a few championships, mainly due to the fact that his son was a terrific baseball player. And one of the coaches on that team was David McGuire. Well, one of the ironies that I just discovered is that I knew that Jack for a long time was the senior editor of Atlantic Monthly. What I didn't realize is that posthumously, Life Without Principle that essay by Thoreau was actually first published in the Atlantic Monthly, but Jack wanted me to assure everybody that he had nothing to do. We all get old, don't we? Let's see, Jane Gordon. Dear Jane, David and Linda and I have had the pleasure of her expertise in touring of Concord, Massachusetts, and Sleepy Hollow Cemetery. Not only a terrific tour guide, but somebody who has interacted in an important way in just about every important landmark in Concord, Massachusetts. But beyond Concord, she's a great historian as well. And then there's Robert A. Gross of Columbia and Penn. And I was struck by the fact that there's another Robert A. Gross of Columbia and Penn who's a physicist. This Robert A. Gross is a distinguished historian who has written about the Minutemen and many other
The other one stole my identity. I said the other one stole my identity.
Yes, well, he was a physicist, and those people, they don't know how to park their bicycles straight. I will not tell you what I used to be a long time ago. And then, of course, there is Joe Stillman. We'll introduce Joe more later, but he's a distinguished producer, director, filmmaker, and he is also an advocate in the great civil rights movement of our day. So I am going to now take a seat and hope that our panel will entertain you, enlighten you, and we will stop at about 4 o'clock. Thank you.
Thank you.
The way I forgot to mention that Jack Beatty was a finalist for National Book Award for this book about James Michael Curley, and he introduced me in Tom Menino's last days to a book that he, the autobiography of Menino, but it's a book that's that Jack, can I use the word ghosted? He helped to produce for Tom Menino. So anyway.
Thank you, Jack. This is how the principled life sounds. I was wondering whether I would just be jumping in front of a train that was headed to where it was headed anyway, and then I would just be personally annihilated. I am here today, not because I want to be. I am terrified. I believe it is my civic duty to tell you what happened to me while Brett Kavanaugh and I were in high school. Of course, this is Christine Blasey Ford, and I can't think of a more moving exemplar of the principled life than this courageous woman who stood for the entire nation to tell her truth, which I'm convinced is the truth, and did it, as she said, honoring a principle, my civic duty. So we have this sort of, I think, civic hero in front of us as we talk about past models. Bob, you're going to talk about the usefulness today, the sort of Thoreau's famous piece on civil disobedience. How is that how does that speak to us particularly now?
Well, I like your beginning with Ford's act of protest, which she did not because she wanted to be in the news. She said she was terrified, but rather out of her sense of duty. And Thoreau as an individual stands out early in our history for his affirmation of conscience, of principle, in the face of a government whose war against Mexico he deemed an immoral act of aggression to extend the kingdom of slavery. And ever since, we've looked to Thoreau and the essay he wrote, originally called Resistance to Civil Government, as a kind of model of the lone figure standing up against the machine, whether it's a corporate machine or a political machine or voluntary associations that don't care about you. But Thoreau is our lone figure. And yet, there's some things about his protest against the Mexican War that I think, and the essay he wrote, that deserve to be teased out a bit to think about our own situation today and political action. For one thing, as much as Thoreau is celebrated for declining to pay his taxes and going to jail for a night in order to protest the Mexican War, his essay actually says very little about the Mexican War or slavery. He does clearly condemn the war and make plain his view of it as immoral. But if you thought you were going to pick it up and find out all the things that the U.S. was doing wrong at the time, you wouldn't find it in that essay. In fact, and this is where it gets kind of interesting, you start to wonder how pertinent is his own act of civil disobedience to the war he was protesting. For one thing, he never publicized his act. He went to jail for the night. During the time he was in jail, his aunt apparently came by, paid the tax for him, and he left the next morning. He never sent a letter to the Liberator newspaper to say what he did. Nobody else around him. No one covered it. The Concord Freeman had apparently no interest in the subject, probably because it was a pro-Mexican War organ, didn't want to cover dissent. But he doesn't, it's not covered, and he doesn't talk about it until his neighbors come to him and he speaks to the Concord Lyceum. By that point, the fighting has all wound down, peace is at hand. When the essay, Resistance to Civil Government, is finally published, the peace treaty's been signed for more than a year. So his act of protest is, in fact, irrelevant to the entire course and conduct of the Mexican War. Moreover, the act itself had no connection. He was refusing to pay a poll tax, and he stopped paying the poll tax around 1842 and 1843 in a kind of anarchist statement of opposition to all coercive institutions, government, the church, the family, whatever. It's a bold statement of the individual against collective power. But not a penny of the poll tax went to finance the war. It paid for local government and county government and state government. If you wanted to pay the cost of the war and you're James K. Polk, you're so glad that we have tariffs on importations of foreign goods. Don't tell Trump. You can pay for a war with tariff revenue. So the whole, and not only had he refused to pay his declined to pay his taxes, but the tax collector, the constable Samuel Staples, hadn't gotten around to dunning him. If Staples hadn't been clearing his accounts around the same time as Thoreau walks into town from Walden and says to him, hey, I really need you to pay up now, he might never have even had the protest. It was as much an afterthought as anything else. So you've got those problems, as well as I say, the fact that he barely talks about the war. So what is he up to? Why then engage in not the act, but the writing and reflection that he does? And here I think the key thing is, his concern is, what does a person of principle, of conscience, of integrity do when the state or society seeks to make that person an instrument of injustice? The heart of the essay is about the obligations of the individual to the state and the states to the individual. And he's clearly attempting to draw out here for us what you should do when confronted with injustice. And here it seems to me we get into a number of problems, because Thoreau is hostile to collective action and sees no duty to participate as a citizen in the Republic as a positive act. Nothing could be a bigger dissent from the world of the Revolutionary Fathers than Thoreau's saying, I see no duty to vote, no duty to participate in the forum. Instead, he lambasts everything about collective action. You might say to him, do what the rest of your family did. Sign petitions to the government denouncing the war, denouncing the annexation of Texas, denouncing the admission of Florida as a slave state. Call for a constitutional amendment to end slavery, to make all the laws of Massachusetts bar discrimination against anyone on the basis of color. Thoreau's family does this, and he signs petitions through 1840. And after that, he's given up entirely on participating in any collective protest of that, and memorials. He says, why should I petition the government or the legislature? Why don't they petition me? So petitioning is out, even though he once engaged in it. Voting he rejects entirely. He says, first of all, it's like gaming. It's gambling. You never know how things are going to come out. Moreover, in American politics, the side that wins only has to have a majority of one. What makes the decision of that majority moral? There's nothing about it. To vote is to express your opinion that something should happen, not to actually make it happen. And so, voting, in his view, has no intrinsic value, nor does petitioning, nor will he sign a pledge that some 290 radicals posted in the Liberator in the summer of 1846, vowing to refuse all aid and comfort to the war effort. That was signed by his two sisters, which in some ways you may say it's more theoretical than actual, because they were in their father's household. They weren't taxed because they didn't have property that would come under the tax. And they certainly weren't vulnerable to military duty. Nonetheless, even as a gesture, Thoreau doesn't sign that. But 1 month later, he goes to jail. And it's likely that the very example of his family was a real prod to his taking a stand. Okay, so he rejects all forms of collective action. So then the question is, under what circumstances do you engage in political protests? Under what circumstances is it important to actually stand up for your principles? And here I think Thoreau is involved in really important thinking. First of all, he's posing the question, how can you be free to act on principle? And the key to him is to live simply, the way he's doing at Walden, to curb your wants, provide as much as possible of your own necessities. Live in such a way that you aren't bought into the economic system, and the system has no purchase on you. Only by rejecting consumerism and complicity in a commercial society can you gain the independence to act on principle whenever you think that's called for. That's a stringent demand that is pretty hard to imagine how any of us these days can really operate on. So we might want to pause and at the end and think about, well, what would be comparable then? How might you get in that position? So then he asks the question, when should you act? And he says, you don't actually have any positive obligation to promote the common good. He says in Walden, he came into this world not to do good, but to be good. And so, when should you act? And he says it's clear that you have to live your life without sitting on somebody else's shoulders. And that suggests that, if nothing else, every individual has a negative obligation not to exploit other people. So long as you're not exploiting other people, presumably you can have a clear conscience. On the other hand, we might think the phrase sitting on somebody else's shoulders, as I was preparing this, I realized that sounds both light and a clear metaphor of slavery, which is not only sitting on the shoulders of bondsmen and bondswomen, but whipping them and taking full control of their bodies. So he may mean by that clearly, slavery as well as other forms of exploitation. But he also, and here's the key thing, he also imagines that we all share a moral compass. If he doesn't spend time in civil disobedience belaboring the evils of slavery, it's because he imagines that that's not a discussion you can have. That all of us, in his transcendentalist view, share in common universal moral standards that are in fact intrinsic to our humanity. Just as the transcendentalists thought that you would know there's a higher power, a divinity, because it's within your own soul. He also says, transcendentalists say, conscience is the voice of God in the soul of man. And from that perspective, the notion is there really is no argument about certain moral things. How would you know when you're called on to act? And basically what he's saying is, when you recoil at what you see, when you instinctively feel that what is before you is an outrage, you know immediately what the standards are and what's being violated. He would have said, abolitionists would have said, when you see slavery, when you see immoral aggression, you know your standards have been violated. When we see children being separated from their parents at the border and the U.S. government is acting in our name, we know what's a moral outrage. So from Thoreau's point of view, this is universal, and this is when you're called upon to act. He also then, I think, has a kind of inconsistency, and I'm going to wind up here. One is we know common moral standards, and we can feel a positive obligation to act on them because we share them. But on the other hand, there's an individualistic pull against that. You don't have a positive duty, but you can't exploit other people. The way Thoreau ends up resolving this in the essay is, I think, a curious thing. He basically suggests that a few of us could be spared to stand up for conscience when so many of us, most of us, can't have the independence from the marketplace and from our daily obligations to do so. That at least there are a few who can hold up the banner of morality and live on it. And here's the problem. He's really imagining a Puritan elite, a Puritan elect, who will now be in mid-19th century America, the moral guardians, the custodians of ideals. And that we will ultimately be thanking them for acting in our name and calling us to our higher destiny. That may be a good thing, but how you separate the ethical duty from a sense of moral arrogance is not easy to decide. Likewise, it's entirely clear when Thoreau and abolitionists are standing up for principle or they're seeking only their own individual purity. It seems to me, as I was reflecting on this and thinking, I'm not going to make a whole bunch of comparisons between the world we live in today and the world of mid-19th century, because we could just be all cheerleaders as a group. But if we reflect on it, how do we see our own readiness to be caught up in the outrage machine, to be morally outraged every minute? And do we deflate the value of our moral outrage when we're upset every minute? There's something to be upset about every moment. But the question then is, does Thoreau provide us a prudent guide to moral protest? Can we slide into our own desires for purity as opposed to others? And last of all, I think finally, is individual action, which Thoreau saw as the only alternative, because politics would corrupt you and it would aggregate you in the vote getting and the like. he sees individual action as something one does and another does and another does. It would be like Alice's restaurant. You all go in and sing a few bars, and then we're all reclaimed. But Thoreau can't see a crucial thing, which is we may learn from each other and grow through collective action and not just individual action.
Thank you, Barb. Thank you for that. Now Jane is basically a historian of about 350 years of Boston and Massachusetts, and especially Concord history. And I've read interviews with her in which she reproduces that history in fascinating detail. So it's going to be very difficult for her to keep her remarks short. But she is going to talk about what does it mean to leave these precincts of virtue and high-mindedness and to move to the, I did say flesh pots of Maine. That might be a little to the gamier parts of Maine. Tell us all about that. The context of virtue.
You Massachusetts Puritans and your moral arrogance. I tell you, you got it. Just as Bob said. What I wanted to speak to you about is exactly as Jack said, what it's like, and I'm taking this now to a more personal level, as a person who spent, much of my life looking at Thoreau and this whole community of Concord, having lived here almost 50 years before I moved, and studying Thoreau and spending a great deal of time, and I know many of you, working with Thoreau, working with groups of all different ages, trying to make him viable and vibrant and connect him to our lives. And I realized I've spent pretty much a lifetime doing that. And that's a wonderful thing, but what I hadn't really done is take the things that Thoreau had to say and apply them to me. And we always joke with each other about, well, it's not all about you. But in this particular case, it was Jane forgetting Jane and making it all about Thoreau and not reflecting back on how those things applied to Jane. Now, there's nothing particularly heroic or extraordinary about my life whatsoever, but I think that makes it more relatable to most of the rest of you. And so for me, kind of a conflation of three things happened: retiring from full-time work, turning 70, and moving to a new place, albeit a place that I knew fairly well, but a place I'd never actually lived full time, and leaving the place where I'd lived all my life. I grew up in Lexington, I lived in Concord, so I'm going, just less than 3 hours north, but going to Maine, to Damascotta, which is actually a marvelous place, and I'm very happy to report that Maine is a very reliably blue state now. And I won't take all full credit, but Lucille and I will divvy up the credit for that, yes. So one of the things that I did about a year and a half ago, when we were just embarking on the 200th birthday of Henry Thoreau, I was asked actually by people at First Parish to give a little talk at the beginning of all these anniversary commemorations. And I decided what to do, that I would do, is take like my voluminous collection of Thoreau quotes that I just wanted to collect for myself, and you can all find many, many sources of wonderful, pithy quotes by Henry Thoreau. But I thought what I'd do is really take those quotes and see if I could make some kind of order out of them that made sense for me. And the question that I was asking, and I was asking it about Thoreau, was what was he looking for? What was he seeking? What questions was he asking himself? And I played around with those also as part of a chapter of the Thoreau Farm's wonderful book that you can all purchase and make Margaret and the board very happy. But it ended up that I found, and I could frame out 6 really distinct questions that helped me in my exploration of Thoreau's life, and these are what they were. One of the questions was, what does it mean to be truly awake? Thoreau talks about that idea of being awake and aware and alive. What exactly did he mean by that, and what were the repercussions for his life of being truly awake, aware, and alive? So that's one. The second was just the whole idea of what does it mean to live deliberately? What does that mean to make deliberate choices rather than just be pushed and pulled back through, forces that you feel like you have no control over? That was it. And again, you can find voluminous passages in all of Thoreau's works where he talks about that. One was the idea of what does it mean to be wild? He talks about wildness, not just the wildness, of lands that are uninhabited, but the wildness of places that are uncontrolled and the wildness within us. And then taking the next two questions really speak to what does it mean then to live as a person of principle in society, as part and parcel of the social world? What does that mean? And Bob has so eloquently talked about that now. I would also add that he takes that same set of questions really, and he applies that to what does it mean to live as a person of principle in the natural world, as part and parcel of nature. So what does it mean to live as a life of principle, or with a life of principle in society? What does it mean to live with a life of principle in nature? And then the sixth one, I should say, is just that question of what does it mean to be Henry Thoreau? So those were the 6 sets of questions, and I want to just really quickly, so we keep right on time here, just to say just a few words about how I started to apply that to myself. So now, if you take those questions and you don't just use them to explore Henry Thoreau, but you use them to explore any one of us, it becomes a really interesting exercise. And part, for me, of moving was just, and most of you know me, I get very busy. We talked about the busyness of life. The slowing down and the taking time to be thoughtful and reflective about life. And it's kind of a gift and a luxury, and I guess something we've earned at the stage in life. Part of that being awake is just noticing, being in the moment, noticing what's around us, not just moving through a place, but being part of that place. And where I live now, right on the banks of the Damariscotta River, I have that time to find that stillness and to really understand my little place in the world and begin to see it through the seasons, begin to see it through the ebb and flow. It's actually not a river, it's a tidal estuary. So I'm seeing the ebbs and flows of the tides. I'm seeing the rhythm of the seasons in a way I never really did before, even though for 46 years I lived in Walden Woods. So that's kind of scary. You have to go away from your home, even if it's Concord, to really understand things. So I spend a lot of time walking. I spend a lot of time kayaking. I spend a lot of time just immersed in a place. And for me, that does go along with leading a life of principle, because it's becoming closer and closer and having that natural tie. Living deliberately, again, making thoughtful choices, maybe about not huge things, but just about the way I fill my calendar and the way I spend my time and my money. And again, not just being pushed and pulled different ways. But I started to think about that as I was sitting on the rocks out in front of my house. I was thinking, I need that balance between being engaged in a community, being with other people, the invigoration of, taking courses and being involved in all sorts of organizations and having that kind of a life, with the kind of life that where I spend a lot of time by myself, and it's serene and it's still and it gives me that time to just be alone and let go and let things be, rather than always trying to make sure things are done on a schedule or that I'm driving something. And I thought about that difference between drive and just drift, just letting things drift. I tend to want to impose time. I'm great. I'd be great at planning battle campaigns. I just love schedules and I love organizing things, and it's really wonderful to just let that go. A little bit. Being wilder, I was always, people said I should have gone to parochial school, although they didn't have Unitarian parochial schools when I was growing up, so it would have been hard. But yeah, I don't have any of those good nun stories. I'd have to fabricate them and it wouldn't work. But just being a little, just throwing off those self-imposed shackles, living in a little less restricted life, taking more risks. I'm a very timid person in most parts of my life. And just being a little bit less conventional, being a little less bounded by the rules that I make for myself. Breaking some of those rules is really, really an important thing. I didn't do it as a teenager, and it's not too late to do it as a septuagenarian. So I'm looking forward to that, and stay tuned. Living with in society, I mean, for 2 years, throwing wadded up socks at the TV screen every time Trump comes on is not doing it for me. I can tell you. So a lot of that, has been involvement in the political process, and trying to donate to the causes I believe in. But a lot of it has also been trying to be honest about my place in society and coming to grips with things like the fact that I am a beneficiary of having grown up a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, that the white privilege is a real thing. I'm coming to grips with the fact that I really didn't understand what it's like to live in a society where race is such a huge part of it, because I just didn't see race in a way that I now need to really understand. And a lot of that is just being honest with myself. So that's a big part of it. That's a huge part of it. Living a life of principle in nature, again, doing the little things that help me to become a good steward, but also really understanding the importance of things that we hold in common, the common lands, the common good. That's an enormous part of me, and the common good extending way beyond my lifetime. And so that's a huge part. And then again, that last thing, just understanding what it's like to be Jane Gordon and being honest with myself. Not reinventing myself moving to a new place. You always dream about the fact you're going to move and nobody knows you, and you have no backstories, nobody knows all your crummy, past, and you can start all over again. That's ridiculous. You are who you are. So you're not reinventing yourself, but it's a time to rediscover yourself, or maybe to discover yourself for the first time. And that's a hugely important thing. And when I just want to finish by saying, again, when we think about Thoreau, we think about him going to the woods and stripping away, to getting down to the essentials of life. He's doing that not to escape anything, but to confront life. And he also doesn't remain in the woods. He comes back out of the woods. He comes into society, and he's confronting things face to face and stripping away the veneer. And I think that's something we need to do in all aspects of our life.
You're here. Thank you, Jane. Joe is going to talk about a 20th century exemplar of the principled life, a kind of honorary specimen of humanity, as I seem to remember him. He's still with us, I take it?
Yes.
And that is Ramsey Clark, and Joe is going to give us a preview of his documentary.
Well, thank you. I'm probably the least qualified or knowledgeable person in the row up here, I'm sure. But I have spent the last 13 years with Ramsey Clark, and I learned at lunch today that Ramsey has something in common with Thoreau. They're both surveyors. And when he was 12 and 13 years old, over 2 summers, he was surveying the northwest corner of Colorado. Had a lot of time on his hands, and had Thoreau's book, or had read Thoreau's essay about a life without principle. And when I started making the film, back in 2012, I asked Ramsey the very first question. I spent 25 hours interviewing him, but the very first question that I asked him, I said, Ramsey, what led you to become the person that you are today? What influenced you the most? And he quoted Thoreau's essay. And I think you'll see that in the film later on today, but the idea of living a life of purpose and of consequence, and it's been an amazing privilege, really, to be able to tell his story and to understand this intrinsic value that he put on this whole concept of living a life of principle, which is hence the title of the film that you're going to see. But You know, it's difficult in a way to try to talk about a man who there was no pretense to Ramsey Clark ever. Imagine in 1972 when he went to North Vietnam at the height of the war, and he apologized to the Vietnamese people, saying that the policies of our government are not necessarily the will of the American people. Imagine what he faced when he came back. Nixon threatened to impeach him, or to try him for treason. I'm thinking of Trump here. But, you know, he was right. It took 20 years for people to realize that, but he was always ahead of his time. He was an outrigger for the 100-plus interventions that the U.S. was involved with. But, you know, I think that the connection between humanity and between the responsibility that each of us have is what I think is probably the biggest factor to Ramsey's connection to Thoreau and the principles that he tried to live all his life. If there's one thing that he fought against was the influence of big money and special interest in governance and how it affected policies that affect all of us. So I think that's probably the most important thing that I hope this film is going to show today to all of you.
Thank you. Can I just ask you one question?
Sure.
And I'll have just a turn it over to you folks. In his legal career, Ramsey Clark has defended Saddam Hussein, Lyndon LaRoche, Slobodan Milosevic, and other almost pariahs, you could call them. Leonard Zakim, the late Leonard Zakim, for whom the graceful bridge in Boston is named, was the longtime chair of the Anti-Defamation League here in Massachusetts. And he wrote this. He said, Ramsey Clark is supposed to be a man of great principle. No one is accusing him of anti-Semitism, but to willingly be a vehicle for the racist views of his clients under the guise of seeking peace is one of the worst examples of irresponsible advocacy. What do you say to that?
Well, I'd say what Ramsey would say, and that Ramsey never defended or never said that any of these people that he defended were great human beings. But he did say that everybody was entitled to a fair trial and the best representation possible, because if they didn't have it, then we wouldn't really have a system that would be fair to everyone. You know, Ramsey defended or represented the PLO for 30 years, as an example. You know, I think that he is a perfect example of someone that could have taken the easy path. You know, he grew up in a family of privilege. His father was the former Attorney General under Truman. His father was also a Supreme Court justice. When you finish as an Attorney General, you usually take a 7-figure salary at a prestigious law firm. You get tens of thousands of dollars for speeches. You write expensive coffee table books. What did Ramsey do? He went to Vietnam. He spoke out against the war. He did probably, as near as I can tell, 80% of his work was pro bono. He lives in a simple apartment in the village of New York that probably hasn't been painted in 40 years. Talk about living a life of simplicity and of, you know, where you're not connected to any monetary sort of thing. But I think for Ramsey, it was his duty to, you know, to represent people that maybe other people wouldn't. When he represented Saddam Hussein, as an example, there were 5 Iraqi lawyers, a French lawyer, one from Switzerland, one from France, and Ramsey, and all 5 of the Iraqi lawyers were killed in the course of that trial. Ramsey was threatened every day that he was there. You know, so you don't take these kinds of cases if you and he did it pro bono, on top of it. So you don't do those if you're not a person of principle, because there's nothing in it for you, really, other than to soil your reputation, maybe. But you do it because if you're going to say, we believe in our democracy, that it has to apply to everybody. And that's why he did it.
Yeah, the case of Clark actually goes right to the heart of the quandary we have, I think. Issue at one level is, do you stand up for your principles? But the second is, what are your principles? So Thoreau assumes we're all going to agree on the principles. But when we don't, how then do we view the person who keeps pushing something? What if we were suddenly to talk about Phyllis Schlafly and her anti-abortion crusade through her career? You could say she held to that principle throughout. So that the question of, the term is so filled with such a positive valence, he or she is a person of principle, that we are prone to overlook the content of the principle. In the same way as, a lot of historians for the last 25 years celebrated populist movements, civil rights movement, and now we know populist movements are hardly unambiguous. So, the terms on which we celebrate acting on conscience have to be squared with what it is you're acting for when you claim conscience.
Please, questions about Thoreau and his connection to us? Yes, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, panelists. That was really thought-provoking, all of you. But I have a question for Bob, and it has to do with the title of Thoreau's essay. So one could say there's no evidence to suggest that Thoreau ever titled his essays Civil Disobedience. And as you were giving your talk, I was just thinking how relevant the title Resistance to Civil Government is for Thoreau. Because when you think of it from that perspective, you can see his move to Walden Pond as a form of resistance. And I just wondered to know if you had any comment on the two titles and how whether you view the essay through either one of those titles, if that changes our perspective some.
It's a really great idea. This suggests a wonderful classroom experiment in which you have half the class read an assignment called Resistance to Civil Government, and the other half gets an essay called Civil Disobedience. And then you ask them to write in advance and see, would it make any difference what the title is? I think that the term resistance catches up something that's so deeply thorough. That is, one, it's a highly active verb. And secondly, you imagine someone standing up forcefully to express a perspective. Civil disobedience in its grammatical suggests something that's happening to you more than that you've done yourself. I think that the notion of his stay at Walden as resistance is important in the way in which Walden's written. Thoreau has a hard time, especially in economy and what I live for, saying anything without having something to oppose first. Only in the course of the stay at Walden and in the course of the book does he gradually start to let go somewhat and explore nature in its terms and not just oppositional ones. But he can never get rid of oppositional framework. It's part of his personality, I think, as expressed in his writing. The other key term is civil. And I won't go on about that now, but we might want to play with what is civil government as opposed to all government. What precisely did he mean by that?
Yes, sir. Oh, what do we have? Jack, while you're right there, this gentleman.
Hi. This is an exciting time to hear all of these wonderful panelists. My question is, it seems like simplicity, and we're talking about Thoreau specifically. How much was he influenced by the philosophy of the Quakers as opposed to the Puritans? I think of everything we're talking about, the Quakers resisted the Puritan government, I think, in terms of Roger Williams and settling Rhode Island. How much influence did the Quakers have on Thoreau and on the general sort of transcendental movement?
Turn that to you.
I actually can't answer that question. I don't know. I don't know. Is there anyone here who can shed light on that? Inner light, outer light?
Well, I mentioned that
Yeah.
his biographies of, at least of Emerson, probably it comes out more in that biography than the one on Thoreau. But that's the only place I've really come across.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I can say is just in general that Thoreau is a voracious reader and you know, is open to understanding and enlightenment from all different religious bodies, but I don't know anything specific.
Here, this gentleman.
I'm also Arthur, like my friend there. I don't know about the Quakers influencing Thoreau, but definitely Bhagavad Gita and yoga influenced Thoreau. So there are people who consider him, even on the internet, you can see, as the first American yogi. All the Bhagavad Gitas that the Hare Krishnas usually have 3 quotes on the back or in the inside, one of Emerson, one of Thoreau, and one of Gandhi, what that scripture meant to them. And then in his other writings, he also speaks of that. And I met Ramsey Clark in Los Angeles in 2002 with Medea Benjamin. We were trying to prevent that Iraq war, all the actions in California and things. You see where we are now. Someone just put a photo of a big billboard in the South. The word has become flesh, quoting the Gospel of John with the picture of Trump, showing him like incarnation of Christ. Can you believe how we can end up now in the 21st century here? Anyway, I appreciate you being here. I just question, where are the students, the young people? There is a scholar who says every high school student in the US should read Walden. So after more than 150 years, where are the young people to hear something of the greatest thinkers that the whole world, Tolstoy, Gandhi, learned from? And myself including, I feel Thoreau the most kindred American thinker. I am a citizen here, but I wasn't born here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Anybody else? Yes, sir. Ma'am? Sir? Can't see. I'm sorry. Forgive me.
This is a question for anyone. By the way, I've enjoyed all of your comments very much. Very interesting and helpful to me. I'm reading Walden right now, almost through it. And this is a question for anyone in the room. Based upon what each of us understands a person of principle to be, would you call, can we think of someone like the usual suspect, Adolf Hitler, as a man of principle, at least on a par equal to Ms. Blasey Ford. Could we call a person who I am getting a very strong sense is not held in very high esteem by the people in this room, and before I mention his name, I want to look for the exit sign to make sure I'm close to it. Could we call Donald Trump a man of strong convictions, a man of principle? What does it mean? What is the moral component of being a person of principle? I understand it to mean principle, like first, your foundational beliefs. Do you have to be, come back to simplify, in the spirit of Thoreau. Could we call Donald Trump a person of principle? Could we call Adolf Hitler a person of principle? What do you all think?
I want to hear Jack. The tone of outrage that we're used to from the radio might come through.
Well, as to Trump, no. I mean, he's all about expediency and whatever. I mean, he's a political chameleon. He doesn't have any principles that I can discern, and he defends that as pragmatism. I do whatever is going to suit me in the moment. Now, Hitler, that's a different case, and that gets to this idea of what are you principled about? And fanaticism is no sort of argument for the purity of the principle. It can be so easily perverted, and indeed, principle is a tough thing for human beings. To me, when I think of principle, I think of a quotation that goes against it. And it's from E.M. Forster, writing in 1939, who said, if I had to choose between betraying my country and betraying my friend, I hope I should have the guts to betray my country.
Wouldn't it depend on your country or your friend?
Well, okay, it would depend on my friend. I have a very good friend here. I can't imagine.
Went a little too far being with the generalizations. Wouldn't it depend on that time?
Well, my feelings, would matter, right? If it was my friend, you'd put the point is, before principle, country, comes, what Forster called the holiness of the heart's affection, which doesn't necessarily deal with principle. It's about the people you care about.
You could make an...
Don't principles come from the affections of our heart?
I don't know. I don't think so.
What we hold to be true, and what we believe, therefore believe in.
Yeah.
So, how are we just categorically saying anyone who doesn't see Trump the way you see him is not seeing the true person?
Well,
well,
and I want to say something else. From the get-go, come into this room, and the first comment you make is about Blasey Ford. Then a whole trickle of comments against Trump, and laughter, and some applause. Is it possible that you could have considered that someone coming to this lecture with good intent, I refer now to myself, might have been someone who voted for Trump, supports Trump, endorses Trump, trusts Trump, and sees in him a patriot and a good and decent man? I'm on the outside as soon as the first words out of your mouth. I wonder if I'm in the right room. There are a lot of us who support Trump who are as good a person, at least potentially, as anyone seated here.
well, who's...
I don't think so. I really don't. Oh, boy. We got Jim McCoskey here. He's taking a microphone out of my hand.
Notice I whacked him.
See that? I'm not even a woman, and he hit me anyway.
Okay, can I suggest something that at the core...
There are a lot of us.
Did you want a response or not?
Of course.
It wouldn't be bad to hear that said once in a while. I walked in Washington, D.C.
Cool.
Reagan died.
I'm mistaken to take someone else by when they answer.
This is the town of Concord.
Thank you.
Yes.
We might think about the name. I would suggest to you a really crucial thing about not the partisan part of it, but the larger one. Question of one thing that's involved with principle, I think, is a concept of our humanity and our common humanity. That when we will say, do I betray my friend or my country? We're thinking here about the ways in which we're bound together with each other as fellow humans, even when we deeply disagree with each other. And I think you're actually calling for that we should recognize that you don't come in a room and appropriate everybody to your own point of view. That you imagine that there can be difference, and it's your obligation to try to understand that difference and where people come from.
I actually have a comment on that more.
Comment here.
Yeah, a comment and a question. My comment is that in that very dilemma you posed, in that very dilemma that you posed, do I save my friend or country? You put your finger on the two major moral psychologies in existence, the one of Kantian principles, or represented most recently by Lawrence Kohlberg, a moral developmental psychologist, or Carol Gilligan, who argued for the situational, for the friendship, for the relationship, for the women who refused to get an abortion on the grounds that would violate a personal relationship, as opposed to the men who, I don't know, they pretended they were and say, of course I wouldn't because it's a violation of life. And those two moral poles between principle and situation have characterized our moral theories for a very, very long time. My question is that the more I seem to learn about Thoreau, the more many lives he seems to have had, and I would put a call out, if you will, and this is as much speaking from my own ignorance as anything else, for many or partitioned intellectual biographies of the man, or several biographies, Thoreau, the iconoclast, the isolationist, and so forth. Thoreau, the collectivist, if there ever was one, Thoreau, the collectivist, I don't know.
Jane, do you have
Comments before we move on to after 4 o'clock?
I just,
now?
one thing, this sort of closely related to this, I think, that sometimes, Thoreau talks about the fact that I make, an extreme statement so that I may make an emphatic one. And it occurs to me, we tend to, to really make heroes of the people who are sort of the uncompromising people who are unflinchingly adhere to their principles and are sort of morally so righteous that they never deviate from what they feel. And we tend to, and people have pointed this out to me, that we tend to not think as much about the people who also try to be a little bit more accommodating and a little bit more compromising. Compromise has become a bad word, often with us, and that we need to think about that. Right? And this was pointed out to me in the context of the 19th century, that we tend to honor the William Lloyd Garrisons, I will not compromise people, and we forget about the Daniel Websters or the Edward Everetts, or people who are willing to be a little bit more accommodationist. We see them as kind of bailing out or morally wavering. So it gets back to that kind of moral puritanical idea that you introduced originally.
But of course, they compromised at the expense of the enslaved.
Exactly, they compromised and left an entire group of people out. Exactly. And for them, in that particular context, the larger good was keeping a country together. So you're basically then looking at a choice of competing goods in their eyes, certainly not in mine, but in their eyes, it's competing goods, which gets much more complex and conflicted. Yeah.
Thank you for a more spirited discussion than I anticipated, and I thought it was going to be spirited. I do have one recommendation before we move on to introduction of Joe, and that is Madeleine Albright's book, Fascism, A Warning. I recommend it to all of us here, all of us.
You're here.